you were at that table, what's the question you would have asked? Which one? One of those mountains, one of his sons, one of you will betray me. But Samuel said, how can I go? Saul will hear about it and kill me. And my observation here is this, class. It's always dangerous to anoint a new king when there already is a king. Especially one of Saul's disposition, who is very capable of violence and extreme reaction when things do not turn out his way. And the Lord said, we're going to read a few verses now without stopping. And the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint the one I indicate. Still not saying which one. Samuel did what the Lord said. He arrived at Bethlehem, and the elders of the town trembled when they met him, and they said, are you coming here in peace? Do you ever feel that way when your pastor shows up to visit you? What in heaven's name are you here for? Samuel replied, yes, in peace I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice. Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons, and he invited them to the sacrifice. And when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab. And Samuel thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass. And this is kind of a waiting game, isn't it? And Samuel said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Jesse then had Shammah pass by. But Samuel said, now the Lord has chosen this one. And Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? There is still the youngest, Jesse answered, but he's back home tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives. So Jesse sent and had the youngest brought in. He was ruddy, with a very fine appearance and handsome features. Let me just stop and make a comment there. Comment number 1. What this chapter says about David's physical appearance is remarkably similar to what Genesis 39 says about Joseph's physical appearance. Both were extremely handsome young men with a lot of obvious appeal. That almost got Joseph into trouble with a member of the opposite sex. And it did get David into trouble with a member of the opposite sex. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. He is the one." So that means David is the 8th son of Jesse. I want to make 2 comments on that. Comment number 1. How common is the theme in Scripture of the younger brother or the youngest brother going ahead of an older brother or older brothers? Does that ever appear elsewhere? Here, number 8 is chosen rather than any of the first 7. Well, what about the book of Genesis? It's loaded with illustrations like that, isn't it? The younger son eclipses the older son. What about Abel and Cain? Number 2. What about Ishmael and Isaac? Number 3. What about Esau and Jacob? Number 4. What about Joseph and his older brothers? And then I think there's a New Testament illustration. Do you know where I'm going on this one? What about the story of the 2 brothers in the parable we call the parable of the prodigal son? It's the older brother who gets scolded, and it's the younger brother who gets partied and welcomed back home. And what do all those situations have in common? Because you know, I'm sure this morning, that it's the first son that gets honored, isn't it? I mean, doesn't the Old Testament teach that the oldest son is to inherit double beyond what any of his brothers inherit? Isn't it the oldest son that carries on the family traditions? I mean, that's the way it's supposed to go. But sometimes God switches things up, doesn't he? And God does not go with the first son. And what do all those stories have in common? You know what they have in common? There's friction in all of them, isn't there? We know what Cain did to Abel. We know what Esau would like to do to Isaac, or Ishmael rather. Isn't it interesting when God does something unusual, there is friction? And I thought about that. I said, I think we see that in churches today. As long as it's business as usual, we're pretty content. But when something unusual happens, like maybe the form of worship, we've all been down the lines, haven't we, of worship wars and so forth. When God breaks out in mighty, mighty revival, does something that we don't often see, there will be some people who say, that's not the way it's supposed to be done. And certainly we know the friction between David and his brothers. Here's my second observation. David is the 8th son. Is the number 8 significant in the Bible? We know the number 7 is significant, isn't it? But is the number 8 significant? Oh, you bet. You're like, well, I guess that's not a good camp meeting phrase. But yeah. Let me give you some instances in Scripture where 8. But the most important thing is, what do they all have in common? Instant number 1. Back in Genesis 1, on those 6 days of creation, there are 8 distinctive divine acts of creation, which means on 2 days there's 2 creations. 8 distinct acts of creation in Genesis chapter 1. The importance of the 8th. Number 2, if you give birth to a son, on what day is that son to be circumcised? The 8th day. 8 acts, 8th day. Instance number 3. How many people were saved aboard the ark? Can you do the math? You probably know the answer, don't you? 1 Peter, I think 1 Peter 3 something says, and there were 8 people who were saved on that ark. 8 acts of creation, circumcision on the 8th day, 8th saved in the ark from destruction that will perpetuate the human race. Number 4. Anybody here read the book of Leviticus? Oh, let me say